Hey everybody, how's it going? Andrew here, and I'm going to do a little bit more of these different types of shout outs, but this one, again, do me a huge favor. If you're a fan of the show, then share it with someone you know. This is a really cool, different style show, so I really am interested in your thoughts as well. But seriously, if you're a fan of this episode, if you're just simply a fan of the show, then share it with someone you know. It means the world and a lot, and thanks. So let's get to the show. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and this is episode 295, where we're going to be talking about battling the odds and scaling your studio by becoming a leader. Now, whenever we consider how to beat the odds and stand out with our games, lots of times we tend to only focus on the product itself. This manifests itself in various ways, but it often boils down to focusing on a lot of different things that don't always lead to solving big future problems you or your studio face. So in this special masterclass-thought experiment episode, we're going to discuss and contemplate how you can be more focused, understand what being mindful of your time really means for you and your studio, and how to leverage that information to scale and become a leader. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, welcome back, and today it's just me, and I kind of wanted to do things a little bit differently today. So with this episode, I kind of wanted to structure it as let's say a little bit of a masterclass, but also combined with a little bit of like a thought experiment or exercise. So I think we'll have some fun with this one. We haven't really talked about some of these topics too much in the past before, but I think overall it's going to be really beneficial and helpful. So I hope you get the most out of this one. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, we're talking about kind of like battling the odds and scaling your studio and becoming a leader. So I wanted to first put some things out there in terms of doing these things, or let's say in general, we all want to like get our game out, create a game and get it out to our games and get it out there and make sure that it's successful, right? In terms of however you define success. But a few things I want to lay out is simply, first off, it's not just luck. Yeah, there's going to be some luck involved of course, right? But it's not just luck. And then also, it's not just about making a great game. Making the best game you possibly can make is obviously an important factor in doing. But but making a great game is so subjective, and doing so and trying, like, you hear all the time everybody's saying like, oh, first you got to start making a great game before you market it, and all that stuff. But it's not just about making a great game. That's a very important part of it. But it's not just about making a great game. And last but not least, it's not just about the marketing. I mean, I think we all know that to an extent, but still sometimes we hope and feel that, hey, if I just had the great marketing, then this would be different for me. And it's not, because I mean, no matter how much time, energy, resources you have for marketing, if the product isn't simply there, or you don't have some luck, or a lot of other things, and in particular what we're going to be talking about in a moment, it really doesn't matter, and it's not just about the marketing. So while it's a little bit of all these three things, what I have kind of started to figure out and realize, what it really comes down to, and these all play into each other, but it's really about being focused and extremely mindful of your time. So think about that for a minute. Now, let me give you some context, though. So recently, I've been realizing the importance of my time, me specifically. And I bucket it into kind of two groups. One is just as it relates to my lifestyle. And that could be everything from spending time with my family, investing in hobbies that I find fulfilling, or other activities, and even exercise and healthy eating, all this other stuff, right? And I wish I could be doing a little bit more of that, maybe as summer starts slowly approaching, or spring, I'm getting in my ahead of myself there. I can invest a little bit more time in those. But that's one area in terms of realizing the importance of my time and what is going to be most impactful, fulfilling, and things like that. And I encourage you to do the same, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. And then the other side of it is the importance of my time and as it relates to my business. So one of the things that I'm doing now is kind of questioning, like, how do I maximize more of my time? And specifically what I want to do is focus on the bottom line things that are most important in my business. And I'll apply that to my life too, but still, what are the most impactful things? What are the most bottom line things that are important to my business? So just to use myself as an example here, that really comes down to business development and building my pipeline, meaning how many people, how many other studios, how many other indie devs do I contact? So that's like outreach. And how many people I have a discussion with, like a lead call. And then ultimately, how many people I work with, like having clients. That's really what the most important thing is in my business, at least at this point in time. So that gives you kind of an idea of where I'm at and what I'm thinking about and such. Now, what efforts, what tasks, what types of things am I doing that all make those things happen, that all help develop my pipeline, that help with my business development efforts? Well, there's a lot. So to attribute and reach those things and to make those things happen, that can consist of networking. It could be writing articles and distributing them, having a website, driving traffic to the website, posting on social media, cold emailing, having a podcast by chance, if that helps, which I think I've shared before. It does to some extent. But besides all these things, that's only some of them. There's a lot more that I could list, and then we could like break it down further. And next thing you know, you're like, oh, wow, this can get really overwhelming. And trust me, it does some days. Especially when you're balancing your lifestyle and having a family with 3 kids, and okay, you get the picture. But the point is, there's a lot of ways to make my bottom line happen. And then I just need to kind of go be smart with this. What do I choose and everything and whatnot? So again, what I do is I go back to the question of how do I maximize more of my time? And it's an interesting question because, we don't often think about it as much as we probably should. Now, I want to do a quick plug to a previous episode where on 282, where I had Tim Bodette of Tire Bite Studio on the show, and we talked a lot about maximizing your time. So in light of what I'm talking about now, I highly recommend, if you haven't listened to that one, go back, check it out, because not only does Tim offer some amazing insights on that front, but he also has a lot of resources that he shares with his process and everything else. And we're going to get into a moment why what he does and what he has talked about on that show before is so important to what I'm sharing with you right now. So when we talk about maximizing your time, there's 2 ways that I kind of look at this in terms of ways of going about it. And not just from my standpoint, but what I feel a lot of other people do too. And one is, again, 2 buckets, but optimization. And that could be, optimizing, big or small things. So let's say your processes or how you do things or being more efficient and things along that line. And interpret that as however it relates to your business, to your work, to your project. And then the other one is solving big problems. Now, the big problems are usually things that require more of an investment, meaning like it requires a lot more time and resources and energy. So what typically happens is that within those 2 groups, we, just people as a whole, like to focus on the optimization side of things. And that's specifically, or generally, tends to be small things. And the frame of mind that people can go through sometimes is like we feel that we have a lot of greater impact than focusing on these things than they usually do. So it's like because we have a little bit more level of control with some of these things and they're a little bit more tangible, we'll focus on these, or because we're more familiar with them, and then it's not an unknown and everything else. Now, optimization obviously is still important, but sometimes with what we're optimizing, it's generally not as impactful as we think. So, and here's the other part of it too. So we might focus too much, and a very specific example is sometimes when I have people come to me and they're talking about marketing and what they're doing and everything, there's so many times when people are very detailed or tactical oriented to the point of they are so high focused on those things that they're missing the big picture. And that can become very problematic. You get tunnel vision. You get the idea of how that can be somewhat debilitating. It's like paralysis by analysis, all these other examples and how that relates to that. So the other part of that too, though, is let's say even if you're familiar with that, if you've been doing a really good job optimizing these things, a lot of times people are optimizing something that there's no developed system for, or there's nothing documented about that system, meaning it's all in your head. And that's not helpful either, because you could form an opinion about something that isn't, there's no information or database on it, even though you're very familiar with it. And without it written down and everything, it's really hard to make this determination, whether you're being effective at what you're doing or not. And then another part I would think is that we don't do this so much because we're thinking too much of the now and not the future. So, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. But basically, the problem is when we're doing these things, we're focusing on the now and we're not focusing on the future. Because the now is a lot more tangible, the present, than the future. Future can be a little bit lofty, right? Or it can be difficult to pinpoint. And so, for example, and relating back to like documenting your processes and everything else, it could be about like, you might have a mindset or thinking of, oh, it's just me doing this. So, or it's just the three of us doing this, or whatever the number of your team is. And you're thinking, because it's just me, it's not important for me to document these things. Well, that can be problematic. And I'll get into that in a little bit in a moment. So now let's talk about finding solutions to big problems. Well, typically feel that we generally go to the opposite way. And I think a lot of it is just because we're so focused in the now and everything that we don't want to invest the time, figuring out the future. Is one way to put it. And those are solving those big problems. That's the future that we have. Like those are our goals, our objectives, our dreams, right? And it might sound silly because it's like, well, of course I want to solve problems in my dreams. But I think when we go back and stuff, we look at it and a few other things happen. And one is we're just afraid to think about it. And the other, like I mentioned before, because it's not really as tangible as like optimizing things that are in the now and we're most focused on. Again, because we're talking about now dealing with the future and not the now. So a big and important thing. And another big reason to this is just having limited beliefs. And some of these could be like, I don't think I can get the funding I need for X, Y, or Z reason, right? Or I don't think I can hire the right contractors and employees. Again, there's numerous reasons why you might feel that way. Or it would take too long for me to to teach someone than me to do the task. Like, you know what? It's just easier if I do it opposed to handing it off to someone else and explaining them and the drill. And, or like, I've just done this enough, so I don't need to track my time. Like, come on, how many of you out there track your time in everything that you do? And it's okay if you don't. I've been there before. It's a weird when you're trying to get to the point where you're like, oh, yeah, I need to track this, whatever, right? But still, these are all limited beliefs. And these limited beliefs really hinder us a lot of the times too from thinking in this broader, bigger problem solution mode, if you will. And so why is this important? Why am I even bringing this up? And And how does this all relate to time in a way, right? Or what I was sharing before, and don't worry, we'll make a full loop back at the end. But but why is this important? Now, the main thing is because working towards solving bigger problems now and overcoming limited beliefs now will actually save you more time. So, okay, we all want more time. We know we're all limited on time. I don't care who you are, how big your family is, if you have a family, whatever your situation is, there's never enough time in the day, right? So that's all important stuff. But what is, hey, if we can figure these problems out and everything, what does that ultimately mean? More importantly, what does it mean for you as an indie studio, as an indie developer? Well, I'll tell you, here's a few things. Having this time and focus, right, is going to mean having a clear vision. It's going to mean that you can start learning faster. It's going to mean you can get more projects, either more projects or just have projects get to the market sooner. Means you can start scaling your studio, and then ultimately you repeat these processes essentially, and it means about focusing on growth and other opportunities. So that's what more time gets you, is all those things. Now, if you don't want those things, that's okay. Like if you're doing this as a hobby and just going easy at it too. But I think with anybody with any type of idea of creating something commercially, a product commercially, then this is a good mind frame to be in. Excuse me, I took a sip of water. So these are all the things, and thinking about these things and thinking about solving big problems isn't just about solving these big problems or these goals and objectives. It's really about taking a little shift in your mindset and having a growth mentality. And this relates to your studio growth, but as I alluded to before, it also relates to your personal growth too. Thinking these ways through and everything else. Again, I'm not going to go into that subject now, but it's still really important because what you do there can also carry over here and vice versa. And it could create one of those things where, hey, it's like your business and your lifestyle starts becoming kind of intertwined in a really good way. We always talk about life-work balance in certain capacities, and it's important to do this and that. And yes, I agree. Of course it is. But if you can approach these things with a similar lens, and I thankfully have been able to do this in some way, shape, or form, and I'm not kidding, it's extremely rewarding. And I think one quick example, I'll digress here for a moment, but one quick example of that happening is simply when I realized from my past experience in working on PPC ads, like specifically like, Google AdWords, or Google Ads now. That's a while ago from AdWords. But I realized certain techniques and things that I was doing actually helped me to play Final Fantasy XII better in terms of the Gambit system. So fun fact there for you. But again, that was something I was taking from my business and work and applying it to life, and it was such a rewarding experience. But that's what I mean by that in terms of having that growth mentality and applying it in personal growth and everything, because cool things like that quick little story I shared with you can happen. And it goes work-life balance and stuff. I know I'm going off topic. That's why there's so many areas we can go into today, but we're staying focused. But that's what I'm saying, and that's why it's important to look at things in different ways too. But anyways, all those things I mentioned before, it really relates to your studio growth, and it can with your personal growth too. And when you start thinking about these things, start thinking in terms of, hey, how do I solve bigger solutions, regardless of who you are, how many people you have on your team, whatever the case may be. Anytime you start moving towards this idea and trying to solve these big problems, by default, and you can agree with me or not, but by default, you're basically now, in either of those cases, you're basically now learning how to become a leader. Simple as that. Now, a couple of weeks ago, or a couple episodes ago, episode 293, another shout out to another episode. I had Cassie Hoagland from Blizzard on the show, and we were talking about basically, what was it? Debunking myths and starting how to start careers in the game industry, right? Somewhat of a broader topic than what we typically have in the show, but Cassie shared a really interesting point. And if you haven't checked it out, you should, because it was a lot more of a deep dive in the industry opposed to like, oh, I want to get in the games industry. It was a little bit more in depth than that. But anyways, part of the things she was sharing was was discussing, and man, I wish we discussed it more, but it was about the importance of learning how to be a great leader, or just be a leader, right? Because the point that she made in this is just, and that she mentioned was just, there's so many times in the industry, at least from her experience, that she has seen, and I'm sure in some cases experienced, that just people in leadership roles weren't necessarily the best leaders. And it's not really any fault to them, obviously, right? But why is that? And this is actually more common, and I'm sure this is something you guys can relate to some degree. I mean, think of one time you had a boss or a leader or whoever, a manager, that really wasn't good at what they were doing, right? So it's a common problem. It's across multiple industries. It happens all the time. But when she was mentioning this, I think part of her saying this and what I took from it is like, overall, we strive as people to, in general, not all of us, but we strive to get into kind of like these leadership positions based on, our work, our own work, what we've done, what we've accomplished. And if you accomplish a lot of great things and stuff, you get promoted, right? That's the typical procedure of that. But in doing that, like, and focusing on these tasks and objectives that get us to that position, we don't necessarily have all the skills or understanding or expertise on how to support those who are now under us when we achieve this new role or even make. Because let's face it, a lot of you right now listening made your own role as a leader or as a studio head or whatever the case may be. Right? I mean, you wanted to start up a company, you wanted to start making a game. And like I said, if you start thinking trying to solve these big questions, by default, you are becoming a leader. Interesting way of putting it, but again, my perspective, but I think it's a good one to consider. But that said, we make these roles, we try to achieve for these roles, but we don't necessarily always have these skills and everything. And that's what one of the main things Cassie was saying is like, hey, when this happens, when you become a leader in whatever capacity, then investing time and energy into knowing how to do that is important. So the reason why I bring this up is because when we start getting into this leadership role, there's a lot of things that start to happen. For example, you can easily usually this happens, this is the first thing to happen, right? You basically become a bottleneck and things don't get done. So if you're a solo dev, for example, and looking to build things up down the road, like right now, by default, you are a bottleneck because everything's on your shoulders. Whether you have contractors or not, you are the bottleneck. And what does that mean for time? Again, we go back to, you can optimize so much, get a lot of strategies and everything from Tim, but ultimately you are a bottleneck. And that's not a bad thing, but depending on what your ambitions, your goals, and everything else, it can be. And it could be limiting. But again, I'm not trying to, just being realistic with putting this out there, okay? But it's the truth. You are a bottleneck. That's one way of looking at it. Again, not a bad thing, but still. Anyways, the next are, like, we also find when we become leaders, teams don't always have a clear vision or are not on the same page. This happens all the time. I spoke recently, I was networking and spoke to another games consultant. And he quickly shared a story about vision, which is, it It's so funny because it's like you hear it all too many times. And basically he was talking to Stu. There's two co-founders, and he started saying, hey, why don't we talk about vision? And they're like, oh, we know our vision. We know the direction, everything else. But then he dug down deeper and found out that both co-founders had a completely different idea on what their vision was. So that makes, if that's the case, then if they're communicating their own vision to the rest of the team, how is everybody going to be on the same page? They're not. It's not possible. And what does that mean for everything else that happens with your project and stuff? And remember all that other stuff we were talking about, being lucky, and making a great game. How are you going to make a great game if no one's on the same page? And it wasn't like their intention to do that, but it was just simply because the vision wasn't clear or defined. So, and that carries on beyond in other areas too. It's not just with your team. It's also with like any external partners you may have. So it could be a publisher, it could be an agency. If you don't have your vision clearly defined, then it's going to be even harder for third parties, for external partners to support you, to do what they do best. It is. And it's already harder because they're already removed from your studio, from your culture and everything else. So you're just making it that much harder for them to do their job. So it's another way to look at it. The other thing too, what happens when you become a leader role is you might find that you don't trust your team and your team can lose confidence. This happens more often than we would like to admit and think. It's part of the reason why we have a lot of turnover and stuff, and we question why people flake out when you got that contractor. Nope, where'd they go? It's a big problem, happens all the time. And then later you're like, I don't know if I want to trust, go through that process and put my trust and everything else into that new contractor or that new employee or whatever it might be. And then if you feel that way, you get a good hire and such, and then you're working with them, but you still kind of in the background feel that way, well, that's going to create problems too, and that's where they can lose confidence. And then another problem too, and this is for everybody, when you start picking up this role as a leader, is you can find very quickly that you get overwhelmed, you're underpaid, and you burn out. That's part of the problem with burnout that we face, is because we accept these roles. We typically don't do all the necessary work it is to fully understand and what's required of us to do them. And then when we're trying to do this, that, the other thing, we become the bottleneck and we don't have that clear vision, everything else. Oh my God, there's so much crap going on to the point now I'm overwhelmed. I'm not making any money doing this. And I burn out. I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. And that's not what we want to have happen. It's not what I want for anybody. And I know you guys don't want it either. So this is the type of stuff that happens when we get into these roles. We get busy. We get focused on the tiny things. We think we're making an impact, but we don't. We feel good when we're busy, but the busy doesn't necessarily move the needle. So what do we do? What do we do to overcome this? Well, it's basically addressing the things I mentioned, which is, one is just clearly define your vision and your mission and update that throughout your journey. So whether it's just you, if you do have aspirations or want to create that studio, to build it in time, have that vision, take the time, solve that one big problem, have a clear defined vision. And it can change and it's okay. Update it as you go. It doesn't mean it's set in stone. Change it as you go. It's fine. But if you have that clearly defined, and then you go to everything from, I'm sure it can help with pitching to investors or publishers or just getting new people on your team, whatever the case. But as long as they know what that vision and your mission is and everything else, at least with your team, you can clearly set those expectations with them. So they're not second guessing what the project is. They're not second guessing what the goal is because you made it clear, you defined it, and you should know it enough where if they're asking you questions about it, you're like, yep. Don't think about it. And if you don't, just be like, hey, great question. I need to think about that. And then take the time to do it, to define it further. So there's never any questions about it. Because when there are, that's when you start losing people. That's when all those other things I mentioned before start happening. So what else? How else to overcome these things, right? Know what it takes to do tasks and projects. That's why I mentioned that earlier about like, hey, we're optimizing this, but we don't have it defined. And yeah, does it sound like it's a lot of extra work and stuff? Of course it is, but that's why you get the really great games out there and stuff, because they're doing a lot of the extra work up front and preparing for it. Not in all cases. Not everybody does that extra work. Again, sometimes it's luck and all these other things. See how it plays in? But we're talking about kind of like how to battle the odds a little bit. And these are ways to kind of do that. It's not to say you're always going to win, but it is to kind of battle those odds. And some of the odds of people doing the extra work. And one of the ways to do that extra work is to know what it takes to do tasks, projects, etc. So like track how much time you spend on projects. Track what your team does. You're not trying to micromanage things, but what you are trying to do is really determine what it is. How can we be more effective with it and everything else? And make sure they know that. Make sure I don't care. I'm not here to micromanage you because I don't have the time to micromanage you. But what I do want to know is what it takes to do these things and how can we maximize our resources and do better and then scale these things, etc. Right? So track the time. Then it's about create a system and document the process. This could be everything from your communications to the culture, etiquette, whatever it is, all the way down to implementation. And I'm not endorsing these things, but Notion's a great thing. Confluence, there's a bunch of others out there. Put it together, like a knowledge graph or whatever. Put it in there, document it. It will save you a lot. And what that also does is help onboarding new team members. It will do it faster. It will empower them. They'll be on the same page. And then this scales operations significantly. So again, what in all that you're doing here was documenting this stuff. Yeah, it takes time. It's a pain in the butt. Oh, I don't like doing it. But guess what? You start solving a really big problem really early on doing that. And then you tweak it as you go. So that way you don't have to worry about it down the road. Because as you get bigger and you get busier and everything else, and then you start doing those things, there's never a good time to do these things. So you're better off, but the better time is probably now opposed to later. That's for sure, before things get really crazy. And it doesn't matter what stage you are. If you already feel that's a point, well, it doesn't matter. If you haven't done it yet, it's probably a really good thing to consider and do. And then again, know what big problems you and your team are solving. This is huge because this really goes back to your bottom line. You know how I said what my bottom line was? Finding, business development and building up my pipeline will determine what your bottom line, what's your that you're working on and your team is doing. What are the big problems that you're solving? So make sure you know what your team is working on to solve your biggest problems. It's so important to know that, because if you're just having them to be busy or whatever else, and you have one person who's doing something that could be better at doing something else or whatever, you need to know that. And so one way you could go about doing this is I'm arbitrarily throwing numbers out here, but ask yourself if their work is solving a $500 problem or a $5,000 problem. Like I said, arbitrary numbers. But basically what I'm saying is determine if what they're doing or what they're contributing to the project is big or small, and how does that look on the overall project. So it's assessing things and doing that. And you know what? You need to ask yourself that question too. So is what you're working on, is that solving a big problem or a little problem? And I get it. Sometimes things arise. You need to help out, do whatever. You're wearing multiple hats. I get it. It makes sense. But at the end of the day, regardless of what the activity is, regardless if it's marketing or development, you ultimately need to know, is what you're working on really impactful, really meaningful? Is it going to solve your big problem? Because if it's not, you really need to reconsider what that is. And if what you're working on and you're doing a lot of other things that someone else can do, then you need to go that step and see okay, what do I need to do about getting someone else to help out with this? Again, start asking yourself and knowing what those other big problems are. So, and last but not least, and I'm not going to go into too much here, is about build and maintain a healthy culture. Right? I think we all know this. We've talked about it here on the show and everything. but still super important. And just some ways that you can do that outside of the vision is just simply keep a level of transparency and trust with others. And one way you can do that is just simply be a great listener. Like sometimes it can be hard to relinquish control and you still really want to do things a certain way. And again, that's why the documentation is helpful. But at the same time, being a great listener is so important because you might think things some way and someone might have an awesome solution to how you've done things, how you wanted it done. And then you're like, oh, that's amazing. And that's just one example of many where being a great listener can do more than just help that person out that you're supporting. Because now remember, you're a leader. You got to support these people. But it also can be a contributing factor to doing everything you're looking to do with your studio and growing it and everything else. You also, again, like I mentioned briefly a moment ago, is emphasize your vision and importance of what your team is working on and how it attributes to the goals. Here's the thing. So many people are underappreciated in their work every day, every industry. It's not just games. They're underappreciated. And people don't think about it because when you're working on stuff, and this is part of the problem with leaders too, is you're thinking me. I know you're not like self-conscious or arrogant and things like that. At least I would assume most of you aren't. But the point is, like, we all think that way. We all think in our heads. It's human nature to do that, right? But if you're not thinking about them, having empathy and all those other things, it can cause problems. But also making sure they understand what they're doing. Because sometimes there might be objections like, I don't want to work on that. It's not as fun and stuff. But if you continue to have them be a part of your vision, of the studio's vision, and of your goals, and show them how they're contributing to those, man, if I hear that stuff like, hey, Andrew, this is what you're working towards. This is what we are going to succeed as a team because of your efforts. How empowering is that? Knowing that, wow, I'm actually making a difference. It's just not the slog on this particular task that I'm doing. I'm actually, it might seem minuscule or not as important, but you made it sound like it's a big deal. How much more productivity do you think you're going to get out of someone if you let them really know and you really convey the importance of what they're doing for your studio? We don't do it enough. And that's a big problem in the industry and everywhere, honestly. We don't. But really emphasizing that vision, making it clear, and knowing what are those big problems, what are the things that they're really contributing to and supporting is just really going to help overcome everything you're facing, everything they're facing, and just building up that culture and everything else. You see how it works. And last but not least, like I just said, make them feel important. And that's one great way of doing it. And it provides clarity. And there's no questions asked, right? And if there are, you make sure they know or they let you know. But anyways, so everything I said, taking it to the top. So when it comes to battling odds, like I said before, it isn't just about getting lucky. I think we established that. It isn't just about building the great game either. Again, that's subjective. And you can always work and strive towards that, but it's subjective. What's a great game? You define what that is and work towards it and everything else, but otherwise it's subjective. And it's also not about how good you are at marketing. Again, you could throw any amounts of money at it. If it's not good, if all these other things don't align, it may not work. Or especially if it's not a good game at all, right? Marketing's not going to save you. But what I've come to realize in myself and what has been top of mind for me a lot lately and what I'm sharing with you today is knowing how to be focused and mindful of your time is simply just going to give you all the information you need to build and scale your studio and put you in a much better position to battle the odds. So I really appreciate you all listening today and hearing me in this kind of masterclass thought experiment episode. Honestly, I would really love to hear what you think about this particular topic. I'm really calling you out now. I know it was a long talk in a way, just listening to me, but please, one call to action here. Let me know what you think about this. Am I right? Am I wrong? Do you have any thoughts, suggestions? How can we improve this discussion? I know it was one way conversation here, but so let's take it offline now. How can we improve it? Just give me a shout out at _Andrew Pappas on Twitter, or you could do at IGM Podcast on Twitter. We'll just keep it simple on Twitter, either of those. And let me know what you think about this episode. It would really mean the world to me. It'd be really helpful. And most of all, I hope that my insights and what I shared with you today can really help with you battling the odds, scaling, but ultimately becoming a better leader. So thanks again for listening, and join us again next time on Indie Game Movement.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.